Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell. Hey, Tia.
Hey, Greg.
It's time for one of the highlights of our week. That is the Monday Mailbag edition, where we get to hear from you, our listeners, asking us any questions, even some comments. Producer Shani B has been raking through the emails, the calls, the text messages this week as well from some of our listeners and viewers who have questions about Georgia politics. Shani B, what have we got?
We've got a ton of questions this week. We'll start off with a text message from state employee in Atlanta. Now that Jackson is the official nominee for governor, how would a Rick Jackson governorship impact state agencies/employees? I know there's a lot of anxiety in my particular agency over return to office mandates and a general overhaul of commissioners.
Yeah, that's a great question, state employee. And I totally get why you want to be anonymous. And expect an overhaul no matter who wins, right? If Keisha Lance Bottoms wins, she will surely bring in her own commissioners. There might be some, stability. There might be some holdovers with either of these candidates. But I also think Rick Jackson, will bring in a fresh crop of state officials. Remember, this is someone who did not get Governor Brian Kemp's endorsement, famously. So sometimes there's, behind the scenes negotiations on keeping certain staffers intact or commissioners in their jobs. In this case, with Rick Jackson not getting Governor Kemp's blessing, I doubt that happened. There might be a little bit of a crossover. There's also some commissioners who are very close to Rick Jackson. I've seen on social media, some state agency heads have said nice things about Rick Jackson even before the runoff. So there might be some. I also know Rick Jackson has some very, very big ideas about foster care, which is one of his passions, Tia. So I'd expect him to play a very big role if he wins with how the State Department of Community Health, how the state DFACS operations work, how state, health departments work. And same thing with Keisha Lance Bottoms, who's promised some big changes in the executive agency. The Georgia governor's office is one of the most powerful governor's offices in the nation, in part because of the really broad imprint that the state executive branch has over all facets of state power and really controlling the billions of dollars of state budget, but also billions of dollars in federal funding that also flows through those agencies.
Yeah, everything you said, Greg, I just would say every new governor, it doesn't matter who it is, how friendly they were with the previous governor, they're going to want to put his or her own stamp on virtually every state agency. So expect a lot of changes at the top. The question is, how much do these new people in charge really want to change how things are run on a day-to-day basis? How many outsiders come in who've never worked at these various agencies before? That will, it's less going to be about Rick Jackson. It's going to be, or Keisha Lance Bottoms. It's going to be more about who they put in place and how much those various agency heads want to change day-to-day operations.
Yeah, and with Governor Kemp, we saw him lean on folks from Governor Deal's administration, even Sonny Perdue's administration as well. For Democrats, if they want to look back at other state officials with long-term experience, they have to go all the way back to Roy Barnes' tenure. So we'll see if Keisha Lance Bottoms wants to dip that deep into the pile if she wins, but certainly she'll be able to find Democrats with lots of government experience as well. Shani B, what else we got?
Here's a text message from Paul in Bushnell. Brian Kemp endorsed Derek Dooley and Burt Jones, both of whom lost. Is this a sign that Kemp doesn't have as much cachet with the Georgia GOP as he believed?
Paul, that's a great question. A lot of our coverage going into this year was really about how Governor Kemp still retained a lot of political clout. He came into the session with the question, will he swing big or will he kind of take a step back? And he did not swing big this session. He did not, take a big, huge political fight and push it forward. Instead, he focused a lot of his political capital on Derek Dooley. He was on the campaign trail with his preferred pick for the U.S. Senate. He was out there really building the campaign operation that surrounded Derek Dooley. And that's why, I think that's why you have your answer. He's clearly a lame duck now. He does not have as much cachet with the Republican Party as he believes. He's still very popular in all of the recent AJC polling we've done, all of the other polling we've seen of the governor. This doesn't mean he's going to, leave office head down, a diminished governor. But we're also seeing him being tested on fronts we never really saw him being tested on. In a recent edition of our AJC newsletter, we wrote about how there was even an attempt by the House to override his vetoes, which is a real rebuke of the governor, didn't go anywhere. It was actually brought by Democrats, but Republicans sat on it for a couple of days and just at least teased it out that they could potentially move forward with it. I never thought they really would, because if Republicans are going to do this, they wouldn't do something, led by a Democrat in the Georgia House. But Tia, at least it was a sign that, Republicans are willing to test Kemp's power right now.
Yeah, and I do think the way Paul wrote the text, he said a sign that Governor Kemp doesn't have as much cachet with the Georgia GOP as he believed. And I mean, on its face, that's true, because he believed he had enough cachet to take Derek Dooley from unknown to Senate nominee. That didn't work. I think he thought he had enough cachet with the Georgia GOP that an 11th hour endorsement of Burt Jones was enough to help Burt Jones get over the hump, because otherwise, I think if he didn't think his endorsement could have impact, he wouldn't have done it. But I think I'm assuming that they felt that Burt Jones was in trouble and hoped that the backing of Brian Kemp could help him. And that just wasn't enough to turn things around so late, into the election season after early voting. That doesn't mean he has no cachet, but I think he perhaps doesn't have as much as he had hoped this election season.
Yeah. And by the way, if you ask Burt Jones, it did help, right? I mean, Burt Jones was in trouble because he was losing the early vote, and their calculations showed that. Rick Jackson's calculations, there's always sophisticated ways that you can tell, based on where you're targeting voters and based on where your most likely voters are, if you're losing the early vote. And Rick Jackson and Burt Jones both showed, their internals both showed Rick Jackson with a pretty hefty lead in the early vote. And so the thought was that Governor Kemp's late endorsement would, help Burt Jones enough during election day to put him over the top. It didn't, of course. But, Burt Jones will say that Kemp still helped him get there. And I know anecdotally, we interviewed a lot of voters out there. We had a whole team of reporters who were asking Democrats why they were voting, Republicans why they were voting. And, more than a few said they were voting for Burt Jones in part because of that Governor Kemp endorsement. So, he still has cachet. It's just, this is going to be both.
Absolutely.
These double endorsements are going to be marks on his legacy. Shani B, what else we got?
Now to some calls. Let's start off with Trenton in Old Fourth Ward.
So I've heard y'all talk a lot about the whole tandem ticket with Ossoff and Bottoms and how that's such a novel idea and doesn't get done a lot. And so my question is why don't statewide candidates do that more often? Even when the lieutenant governor is concerned, I don't remember seeing Stacey Abrams and Sarah Riggs-Amico in 2018 doing a lot of events together, running as a ticket. I didn't really see Stacey Abrams and Charlie Bailey doing that either in 2022. So, why don't lieutenant governors get used more, and why don't tandem tickets get used more?
That's a great question, Trenton. I've been on campaigns where I've covered campaigns where there's a bus tour with all the candidates getting together. Nathan Deal had that in 2014, where he was on a bus tour with pretty much all the statewide contenders, and they were all kind of roped in together. As one goes, so go all. But even that same campaign, he was not campaigning alongside David Perdue, the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate in that cycle. So sometimes there's various reasons. Sometimes, if both aren't on the same page on that, even if they like each other, they're not campaigning together. Sometimes candidates want to distinguish between federal campaigns and state campaigns. Sometimes there's a personality reason. The candidates just don't get along, or they don't be saddled with some of the baggage that one of the down ticket candidates has. I remember when Jim Beck was running for insurance commissioner, and a lot of Republicans did not want to be seen with him. There was a candidate for superintendent, a Democratic candidate for superintendent in 2022 that, did not campaign with the rest of the ticket, did not campaign with Stacey Abrams. And I think the easiest example, Tia, that we have is the 2022 race, where Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock were they were political allies all in the run-up to the campaign. It was Stacey Abrams that helped kind of clear the field for Raphael Warnock in 2020 when he decided to run for the U.S. Senate. But when 2022 came around, there was a real decision by the Warnock campaign to sort of go it alone, to make this all about the federal race. By then, Stacey Abrams' negatives had grown higher. there was concern among national and local Democrats that she did not have the same, sort of energy and momentum behind her that she had in 2018 when she almost won the governor's race. And so we only saw them campaigning together a handful of times on the campaign trail rather than running more in tandem like we're already seeing Jon Ossoff and Keisha Lance Bottoms do.
Yeah, Warnock, I think we should just say it plainly. His team advised him, and it was their team thinking that Stacey Abrams was not going to be a help to Warnock, and they wanted to go it alone. And they didn't want Stacey Abrams dragging that campaign down. I want to say in 2018, I do remember Abrams and Sarah Riggs-Amico doing rallies together. Again, not all the time, but it wasn't like they never campaigned together. I do wonder if Josh McLaurin's going to show up. We're recording this early, but there is a big rally that will have just happened when this episode comes out. We'll see who else on the Democratic ticket shows up with Ossoff and Bottoms in Savannah. I wouldn't be surprised if other candidates running statewide in Georgia are also invited to Savannah. But the other point that I was thinking about is, they talk about, I can't remember the saying, but three's company, four's a crowd, something like that. There could be a point where you get too many people. Okay, we got Ossoff and Bottoms. Okay, can we invite McLaurin on? Okay, all right. Can we invite the person running for insurance commissioner or school superintendent it's okay, now it's getting too crowded. We've got everybody's team trying to get on one accord, everybody's team trying to sync schedules. Now it's too much. So I think that's also a calculation, just the logistics of involving too many campaigns in these various events. But I do foresee Democrats having events, particularly if someone big comes into town, like a Barack Obama or a Michelle Obama. You'll see all the statewide candidates. And same thing, if Trump comes to town or J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, you'll see more of the candidates on the ballot all being invited to those events.
Yeah, and that's different than running, on the campaign trail together. And that's what will be interesting too on the Republican side too, Tia, is we'll see if Mike Collins and Rick Jackson, who, Mike Collins, his office is basically across the street from Burt Jones. They never endorsed each other on the campaign. They kind of ran their own races, but they were very close. They both go to the same church in Jackson, Georgia. They both come from the same hometown of Jackson, Georgia, in beautiful Butts County. So there's not the same sort of symbiosis between Rick Jackson and Mike Collins. They will still show up at the same events together, I'm sure. We'll see them if Trump comes to Georgia, they'll both be on the stage together. But it'll be interesting to see how they prosecute their campaigns and how closely Rick Jackson wants to tie himself to Mike Collins, because as we sit right here, at this early stage in the campaign, Jon Ossoff is looked at as the favorite in the Senate race, while the governor's race is much more seen as a toss-up. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to dive more into your questions, your texts, your emails to our hardworking producer, Shani B. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to our Monday Mailbag edition of Politically Georgia. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell. A reminder, if you've got a question for our mailbag, you can call the Politically Georgia hotline anytime and leave your question at 770-810-5297. You can also email us at politicallygeorgia@ajc.com, all one word. Our hardworking producer, Shani B, is standing by with a legion of interns waiting to take your calls, your questions, your texts, your emails, all of that. Speaking of that, Shani B, what else we got?
We have a call from Michael in Gwinnett.
We are hearing news that there will be a second runoff in Gwinnett County, or maybe it's statewide, not quite sure. Didn't think that Georgia had secondary runoffs. Any clue or information that you can provide?
Yeah, great question. There's not a secondary runoff in Gwinnett. The runoffs already happened in Gwinnett. There was also a special election, though, and that might be what this was about. Nabila Parks stepped down from her Gwinnett State Senate seat, Gwinnett-based Senate seat, to run for lieutenant governor. She lost that race, but that opened up two basically elections. One for the remainder of her term, the other for the next 2 years of her term. So in that race, Ruo Roman, who ran for governor, ended up dropping out of the race for governor to run for the Senate seat. She ran the next 2 years. But this is a really interesting election because Adrian White ran for the remainder of that special election seat for the remainder of that term. And this was a real big battle, Tia, that Sophia, one of our staffers, wrote about, because this is a Democratic-leaning seat. The Democrats should win in November for the next 2 years. But at the same time, Republicans overwhelmed in turnout because these were two marquee races for governor, for Senate. There was a lot more reason for Republicans to show up for these races in the runoffs than Democrats. And so Democrats were really worried about a Republican sneaking through and winning the special election. Adrian White ended up beating the Republican candidate Aziz Sheikh by about 300 votes. So depriving Republicans of something of basically a showcase victory that you'd hear from now until November. So this was a big victory for Democrats, a big defeat for Republicans in a race that they should not have been as close in, but because of the logistics of the runoff, they were.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans would have had bragging rights, but they also would have had the seat for a few months until Ruo Roman, who's likely to win the seat in November, took over, right? But I think it goes to show the wonky nature of Georgia's seemingly endless cycle of elections. There are always all these special elections. And on one hand, you get it. You want to fill the seats so that people can have representation. But because so many people resigned ahead of the election this year to run, statewide or for other seats, but they resigned at different times. And because Georgia doesn't have resign to run laws, so other people chose not to resign before qualifying for the race. There's just all these special elections make it really interesting and really tough for voters, I think, because you had to message, just like that special election for the Supreme Court seats that were on the primary ballot, but these weren't primary contests. These were nonpartisan contests, but on the primary ballot. And, there's a lot of concern from Democrats that they were confused and they thought no matter who they voted for, someone aligned with their ideals would be moving forward in those Supreme Court races. That was not the case. Now we have a special election, again, a special election between a Republican and a Democrat. But during the runoff season, where a lot of Democrats thought, well, the most important races have been settled. Maybe I don't care to vote in the runoff for lieutenant governor or other things. Now, the alternative, I was actually here in D.C. having dinner with an old source who's running for Congress in Florida, and their primary is in August. There are no runoffs in Florida, and this is a primary with, I think he said, 7 candidates. So it's likely that whoever wins the primary will win it with 25% of the vote, 30% of the vote at best. And once that primary is over, that's it. And it's a safe seat for Democrats. So whoever wins that primary with maybe 20 to 30% of just the Democratic primary vote will be the representative. Whereas in Georgia, you would have to get to 50%.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of reasons for that in Georgia. There's going back to Jim Crow era politics of basically the white establishment that ran the Democratic Party at the time worried that splintering of the white vote would make it easier for a black candidate to kind of sneak through if those were the rules. And if you want, we've written all these deep dives on that. So you can Google it at ajc.com if you want more details about how that came about. Jenny B, what else we got?
Next is an email from Jordan in Atlanta. Rick Jackson won the governor's race despite Brian Kemp backing Burt Jones at the last minute. Does that mean Kemp is already a lame duck, or did he become one the second the polls closed on runoff election day?
Great question that we kind of already touched on a little bit about Kemp's clout, but yeah, I think the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is Burt Jones also became one of his allies told me he was like the lame duck of a lame duck, right? He was already a lame duck as a lieutenant governor, which meant, of course, he was not running for re-election and he's in the last throes of his term, but also he lost the race for governor as well, the Republican nomination contest. So it's interesting, Tia, because you do have this question of who leads the Republican Party in Georgia right now. Governor Kemp is on his way out. Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is on his way out. The 2 U.S. senators are both Democrats. The party, Georgia GOP, is not the power that it was just 10 years ago. Josh McCoon's the chairman, but he doesn't have, Rick Jackson didn't even show up at his big fundraiser. Rick Jackson's the Republican nominee, but 47% or so of the party did not vote for him in the runoff election. Mike Collins is the Republican nominee for Senate, but a significant number of Republicans also didn't vote for him. So who is the Republican leader right now if Governor Kemp is on his way out and is the lame duck that we see him as? That's a telling question, I think, that will really influence the rest of the election cycle for Republicans.
Yeah, and I think if Collins or Jackson wins in November, that'll be your answer.
Sure.
I think to your point, Kemp, I think, remains the de facto leader. But again, we know he's weakened by the fact that he's a lame duck. He's weakened by the fact that his preferred candidates will not win in November. They're out of the running. But I think he's it for now. But if either Collins or Jackson wins, they become the new leader. If both win, I think Jackson will become the new leader. If neither wins, then I think we're going to have to see what other races that Republicans were successful statewide. And quite frankly, if Republicans have a lot of losses, McCoon is probably going to be out as the leader of the state party.
Oh, I will not be shocked to see Josh McCoon not seek another term. Also, he served 2, so that's sort of the standard in the Republican Party. But I think you're going to see a whole new crop of leaders no matter what, right? Shani B, we have time for one more.
Let's do this last one from Jalen in Smyrna, who emailed this question. Jon Ossoff called Mike Collins a bigot and an anti-Semite before the votes were even counted. Is going that hard, that fast a smart strategy, or does it risk turning off moderate voters he'll need in November?
Great question, Tia. You wrote about this the other day.
Yeah. So Jalen, first, a little fact check. He waited until the race was called. Now, you can argue that votes were still being counted, but the race was called. It was not mathematically possible for Derek Dooley to gain any lead back from Mike Collins. Mike Collins had won, and the race was essentially over, even if the votes were still being counted. But he did go hard. And I think time will tell whether that's a smart strategy. I do know that there are people who wonder, does Ossoff risk turning off people in the middle by speaking so sharply against Collins? It's early. Right now, they're trying to define each other for people who are paying attention. But I think both candidates know most people are not paying as close of attention as they will in, late September, October, when it's time to actually start making a decision and getting ready for early voting. So we'll see how sharp Ossoff's tone is in these next couple of months.
I think it'll probably get even sharper. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel. And please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. You can also follow the Politically Georgia podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast platform. Wherever you're listening, we always appreciate your comments, your ratings, your reviews, and, of course, your questions. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.